let me introduce myself in a few words. I'm Alan Myers. I'm the chair of the Australia-India Institute and coincidentally, the Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, where the Institute resides. Welcome to all the participants today and in our India Week program. This is the Australia-India Institute's 5th India Week and its biggest ever, with over 30 events. Notwithstanding the restrictions that COVID imposes on us, the acting director of the Australia-India Institute, Professor Ashok Kumar, and the Australia-India Institute staff have organised a very interesting and diverse program for us. I note that this India Week coincides with the celebrations of the 75th anniversary of the independence of India, the independence that is from British rule. India has been independent many times, I think, and this is the most recent. I encourage everyone who is participating to register and enjoy as many of the programs as she or he is able. I thank in particular our partners who've contributed to the program, and I thank our guests today, especially the High Commissioner for India in Australia and the High Commissioner of Australia in India for their participation in the panel discussion about to begin. I don't think there's anything more I need to say, except that India Week is formally declared open or going or whatever is the very progressive verb that describes what we're going to be doing, the energetic verb that describes what we're going to be doing. Over to you, Michael Wesley.
Chancellor, thank you very much and welcome everyone, and particular welcome to the two High Commissioners with whom I've had recent and very warm conversations. It's a great pleasure for me to be participating today. Excuse me. Australia-India relations has a very personal angle for me. I was born in India, and as I was just saying to Suhasini as we were getting ready, she is in Missouri, where I spent the first 4 years of my life. So I feel a very personal connection to what we're talking about today. Our first panel is a fantastic lineup. We're talking on the subject of Australia and India, education and economic relationship and future outlook under the comprehensive strategic partnership. And we've got a wonderful lineup of speakers. First of all, we're going to hear from the two High Commissioners, and let me very briefly introduce them. The first High Commissioner to speak will be Mr. Manpreet Vohra, the High Commissioner of India to Australia. Mr. Vohra is a career diplomat and has held important assignments as India's ambassador to Afghanistan and Deputy High Commissioner to Pakistan, and recently became India's High Commissioner to Australia, completing his last post as High Commissioner to Mexico. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and a postgraduate diploma in International Trade from Punjab University, Chandigarh. He was a Chevening Scholar at Oxford University in 1999 to 2000, where he obtained his certificate in diplomatic studies. The next speaker will be the Australian High Commissioner to India, the Honourable Mr. Barry O'Farrell. Mr. O'Farrell served in the Parliament of New South Wales from 1995 to 2015, including as the state's 43rd Premier between 2011 and 2014. As Premier, Mr. O'Farrell initiated and led annual trade missions to India to promote economic, cultural and social links between New South Wales and the states of India. He has also served as New South Wales Special Envoy for India and has made a significant contribution as the Deputy Chair of the Australia-India Council Board. Mr. O'Farrell has a Bachelor of Arts from the Australian National University in Canberra. Following the two High Commissioners' presentations, we will have a panel of expert commentators. to expand on and reply to what the High Commissioners have said. First up will be Ms. Suhasini Haidar, Diplomatic Editor and Deputy Resident Editor of the Hindu newspaper, and of course a board member of the Australia-India Institute. Following this will be Mr. Peter Varghese, the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, a former High Commissioner to India and author of a comprehensive India economic strategy to 2035, commissioned by the Australian Prime Minister and submitted in July of 2018. And then we will have Professor Manisha Priyam, who works on education policy with the National University for Education Planning and Administration in India. Following this panel discussion, we will have 5 to 10 minutes for a question and answer session with the audience, and I would ask guests to submit their questions via the chat function. So without further ado, can I hand the microphone to you, High Commissioner Vohra. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you again. Professor Myers, High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell, former High Commissioner Peter Varghese, Suhasini. I know all of you. I'm delighted to get to know Professor Ashok Kumar and Professor Priyam as well today. Thank you, and I'm delighted that India Week is again happening. I would have loved to be physically a part of it in Melbourne, but alas, these are curious days, and I hope that they don't last for too long. But I'm happy that we are going ahead, with a virtual format at least, and delighted, as I said, to be a part of it. I've been asked to speak on a couple of issues, and I will try and cover those. But just to open up, India-Australia relations are underpinned by several commonalities, including our democratic ethos, our common values, our economies full of strong complementarities, and of course, our shared Indo-Pacific region. It is a comfortable and a natural partnership where we also see eye to eye on most major issues, international issues, and cooperate on them, be they challenges or be they opportunities. The over 700,000 strong Indian diaspora in Australia, growing rapidly, serves as a living bridge between our nations and our people. Besides enriching Australia's economy and society in multiple ways, they have assimilated seamlessly here. They are law-abiding and deeply respect the Australian way of life, even while proudly preserving their Indian roots, traditions, and culture. Some of that color and diversity, I suspect, would have been on display during India Week, but I suppose we must accept that the COVID-19 pandemic will continue to disrupt our plans and our normal life for some time to come. The virtual summit between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison on 4th of June last year was historic. Our bilateral relations were elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership 11 years after we had forged our strategic partnership in 2009. This is testimony to the steady transformation of our ties over the last decade. The warmth and personal connect between our leadership is noteworthy. Our comprehensive strategic partnership is marked by growing convergence of views on geostrategic and geoeconomic issues, and a strong desire to work together for a region that is more free, secure, and prosperous. Foreign affairs, economy and trade, defense, education, science and technology, and a host of other ministries, departments, institutions, and organizations on both sides have stepped up their collaboration and are working together on myriad issues. We have also agreed to elevate our 2+2 Foreign and Defense Secretaries dialogue to the ministerial level, in underlining the positive trajectory and growing content in our bilateral relations. India and Australia engage with each other in various plurilateral and multilateral formats as well. The Quad came of age with the first ever Quad Leaders Summit in March this year. The positive outcome of the summit, especially in the areas of vaccines, climate change, and emerging technologies for the Indo-Pacific, underlines our strong commitment as democratic and like-minded partners, not only for the provision of global commons, but also in promoting a free, open, secure, prosperous, and inclusive region. Coming to the economic relationship, while the macro numbers are not so bad, it is my belief that our bilateral trade and investment remain significantly below potential. But the good news is that we are jointly committed to improving this for the mutual benefit of both economies. We have re-engaged on negotiating a fruitful and enduring comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, since both sides agree that it is time to take our economic and trade relations to a much higher growth trajectory. You are all aware of the visit to India last week by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott as a special trade envoy, precisely for this purpose. Many of you would also be aware of recent World Bank and IMF projections that India will be the fastest growing major economy in 2021 and 2022. This should be exciting news for Australian businesses, and I want them to shed their old perceptions and appreciate that India is today an easy and welcoming place for business and one of the most attractive destinations for foreign direct investment. We have ushered in simplification and reduction of taxes, new labor laws, production-linked incentive schemes in exciting manufacturing sectors, and have empowered institutional arrangements to handhold new investors. Infrastructure stands vastly improved, and supply logistics and transportation speeds are now among the best in the world. It is not surprising, therefore, that FDI into India did not decrease in 2020 despite the pandemic. A paradigm shift that I am witnessing in Australia is the realization that its future economic prosperity and security cannot rely on any single country. Similarly, Australian companies simply cannot remain producers and exporters of primary commodities only. They must also diversify into value addition and manufacturing. This is where the open and globalized Indian market of over 1.3 billion, together with the new ease of doing business, opens up vast opportunities for Australian businesses. They can export more to India. They can create value and supply chains with Indian end manufacturers. As an example, with joint efforts or joint ventures to create an entire virtuous ecosystem, lithium could be processed and refined in Australia, something that doesn't happen at the moment, adding local value, to be then sent to India for manufacturing and assembly of batteries for use in our ambitious e-mobility plans and targets. For those Australian companies wishing to move into manufacturing of almost any product and finding that the economics of doing so perhaps do not make much sense locally here, come, as we say, make in India for the Indian market and as a base or hub for the region and the world. The Indian stock market is booming and setting new records. Australian superannuation funds ought to seize this opportunity for good and long-term returns. Regarding education, the number of Indian students coming to Australia has steadily increased, and there are well over 100,000 now, making Australia the second largest foreign destination for Indian students, and I believe of huge benefit to Australia in multiple ways. I hope that an early solution is found to bring back those of these students who have found themselves unable to return to Australia since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. They are suffering, and they are suffering big. Some of you may have seen my interview in The Guardian today, where I have discussed this in more detail. But beyond education exports, I feel that our universities, governments, and research and development organizations can step up their collaboration and joint research. There is some good work already underway, but much more is possible. For inventions and innovations coming out of Australia, the local market is often simply too small to take them to market. And inability to commercialize research can be a dampener for research enthusiasm itself. This is where, once again, the huge Indian market, with its possibilities of massive scale, makes a lot of sense. Vocational education is another exciting area. We in India are committed to vastly improving both our skill sets of our people and the way we go about imparting those skill sets. This is where we are already collaborating with Australia to try and improve curriculum standards, qualification standards, and I have no doubt that this collaboration will be of great use to India as we try to improve our system. But I also find that there is low-hanging fruit on this side of things, which could be seized rather quickly. From my perch here in Canberra, I do find that there are a large number of skills which are in shortage, and some of those shortages are growing, particularly in the mining industry, including semi-skilled sort of professions that you need over there. Now, this is where I think very quickly we could try and see if there could be a mapping done of the shortages here, identify the people in India who could be trained, perhaps initially in India quickly, and then much more on-the-job training at the mine fields itself here in Australia. I think that's a win-win that immediately gets over the shortages in the Australian sectors quickly, and then trains our people for the long run, where they can come back and employ those skills in mining in India itself, which is set to get a huge fillip under the new policies for mining that are underway. Overall, I find, and I hope other speakers agree, that this is an exciting time. Perhaps it's never been more exciting for India-Australia relations. And well beyond, as some put it, and I know Peter Varghese's brother, Jim Varghese, is very fond of this phrase, well beyond cricket, curry, and Commonwealth. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to listening to the other speakers. Namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner Vohra. Really interesting comments, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss in those. The questions are already starting to come in. High Commissioner O'Farrell, can I give the floor to you?
Namaste from the Australian High Commission here in New Delhi. And thanks for the introduction, Michael. And I was watching you partly during Manpreet's speech because, you know, if there wasn't lockdown, you couldn't stand where you are and not be disrupted. So there's the odd benefit for a university teacher to be able to stand in a quadrangle and not be harassed. Look, it's a real pleasure to join with the Australia-India Institute in your India Week, especially in such esteemed company. And I acknowledge all of those distinguished speakers who we'll hear from today. Manpreet always is worth listening to. And whether I wake up this morning reading The Guardian or whether it's his other comments, it always causes pause for thought. And happily, we have a strong relationship and we're working with each other because, as Peter Varghese will know, the two people who work full-time in this relationship 24/7 are the High Commissioners in both countries. It's good to see Manpreet again today. I want to begin with a simple statement that reflects something that Manpreet has said, and that is that India and Australia, in all aspects of the relationship, including education, have never been on stronger ground than they are at present. And the importance of that relationship was again highlighted last week when former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, Prime Minister Morrison's Special Trade Envoy for India, was deployed here in furtherance of both our countries' desire for a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement. As our lives begin to return to normal here, which is a testament to India's COVID management and the vaccine rollout that's underway in India, it's important we keep our eye on the things that matter to our nations in the long term. And it's no surprise to anyone who knows me, but equally to my country, that that's especially the economic well-being of our citizens. And this places international education firmly in the context of the bilateral relationship between India and Australia, and emphasises its centrality to the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, or CSP, for economic prosperity, soft power and regional security. Prime Ministers Modi and Morrison stated their belief when signing the agreement last year that the CSP reflects India and Australia's strong commitment to practical global cooperation to face major challenges, especially like COVID-19. The power of education to build people-to-people links and soft diplomacy for regional security is undeniable, even for a neophyte diplomat like myself. The framework for education engagement in the CSP makes clear that education, research and skills are central components of the relationship, which underpin the progress and growth trajectories of our nations, and the exchange of students and academics between our countries generate those valuable people-to-people links that Manpreet mentioned. Though the CSP was delivered in the midst of a pandemic, we've worked hard to try not to let it impede our ambitious bilateral agenda. I'm as passionate about the CSP as I'm about education, and I'm determined to do everything during my time here to enable the delivery of those commitments that our Prime Minister signed up to mid last year. In the midst of the pandemic, it was impressive to see the Modi government pushing ahead to implement transformational education policy agenda following last year's release of India's national education policy. The timing was perfect, while of course the major reforms relate to domestic education framework. The aspiration to internationalise India's education system has created interest globally, and importantly, an opportunity for Australia and India to leverage our commitment under the CSP to help mobilise that vision of the NEP. India's ministries of education and skill development and entrepreneurship are both fully engaged with their own Department of Education, Skills and Employment to this end. And this is seeing opportunities being created for Australian expertise and institutional collaboration. All of these efforts in the field of higher education, research and skills were enthusiastically appreciated by the then Ministers of Higher Education and Skills, Dr. Pokhriyal and Dr. Mahendra Nath Pandey, respectively, when I had the opportunity to meet with them virtually last year. I'll soon be meeting with the newly appointed Minister for Education and Skills, Dharmendra Pradhan, who for the first time has both portfolios in his remit. Putting them together is a clever move by Prime Minister Modi, given the importance he places on fully integrating education and training into the education journey of all Indians for both job readiness and employment flexibility. When we met with Tony Abbott and Prime Minister Modi last week, he reflected on his visit in the late 90s to Australia and to the vocational education institutions he saw then, and he's keen to see replicated here in India. Notwithstanding the pandemic, areas of bilateral collaboration in education that are actively being pursued include scoping opportunities for training of faculty through online delivery where appropriate and face-to-face, research collaboration and exchange in areas of mutual benefit. At the last count, there were over 9,000 joint research publications and over 500 institutional partnerships of one kind or another between our two countries. Policy dialogues on recognition of qualifications, quality assurance of regulation in VET and higher education, transnational education, not just Australian enterprise onshore in India, but we want to see more Indian campuses here in Australia, and perhaps most sensitive at all at the present time, student mobility. I'll come back to student mobility, Manpreet. I'm excited by the emerging opportunities in VET. As someone who came here as Premier on a number of occasions pursuing that ambition, I know it's not easy, but a new memorandum of understanding on cooperation in vocational education and training was signed under the umbrella of the CSP. Late last year, Australia and India held the inaugural VET-MOU joint working group meeting, which injected fresh energy into the cooperation. Policy dialogues between our countries have since taken place, and proposals have been developed for government-supported skills training projects. Now, Manpreet mentioned it, and I mentioned it earlier, student mobility. Australia shares the frustration that the pandemic has interrupted student streams to study in Australia, and in fact has impacted the overseas study experiences of students globally. You know, regrettably, we have students in India who would otherwise be in Australia studying online, and equally regrettably, we have Australian students in Australia who are also studying online. Now, we know the Australian government is in discussion with all states and territories about continued planning for international student arrivals when conditions allow. Personally, and Peter Varghese is about to groan at what I'm about to say, but personally, one of the learnings for me from the pandemic from afar is just how little sway the university sector seemed to have with governments, notwithstanding the significant contribution that the university sector makes at both a state and a federal government level. The Commonwealth has also received recently and supported international student arrival plans from both South Australia and New South Wales. While this is a positive development, the numbers of returning students involved would obviously be small. We know here in India that we operate in a competitive environment when it comes to attracting students to India. Australia's never had it its own way, but we do believe that a combination of quality education at a price point that suits India, within a proximity that also suits Indian students, continues to make us a competitive destination. And whilst there are concerns expressed about the impact of border closures on our prospects, we are in no confidence here, given the ongoing interest to the High Commission, that once borders reopen, that those students will continue to flow into Australia. In all my discussions here, it's clear that Indian students remain an important part of the Australian community, and to those of us who are currently working outside of Australia, we certainly look forward to welcoming them back. And I want to give an assurance that the Australian High Commission, we're in dialogue with both the Australian and Indian governments on this matter, as well as having spoken and heard from students and their families about the frustrations that Manpreet accurately says are real for them. I don't imagine for a moment that it's easy on students or their families, but as I said, I do remain optimistic, and I can imagine a time when student mobility will return to its normal pace between Australia and India. As I've said, under the CSP, Prime Ministers Modi and Morrison are committed to strengthening our economic relationship through re-engaging on that bilateral CECA or Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement that we've mentioned earlier. CECA would further enhance the bilateral economic relationship, as it has through its existence between India and Japan, which is, of course, another Quad partner, and, of course, India and ASEAN. Australia and India want to work closely with our other trusted partners to promote resilience in the Indo-Pacific region, where sovereign states make decisions which are free, of course, from coercion, interference, and aggression. Trade and investment diversification through new and upgraded trade agreements, such as a comprehensive CECA, will help build this reliance. Hence, the mission Prime Minister Morrison sent Tony Abbott onto India last week. Securing a CECA will realise the full economic potential of that relationship. And like Manpreet, and I know like Peter Varghese in his seminal report, we know it is currently underdone. As Peter Varghese's report has outlined, there's a high degree of complementarity between the Australian and Indian economies. Australia recognises India's capacity to become a world manufacturing hub, as well as a market for emerging technology, reflecting the Prime Minister's vision for a self-reliant India. We want to work with India to achieve this ambition by making Australia a partner of choice, a reliable, trusted partner of choice, to create reliable and ethically sourced supply chains for a range of inputs, including, as Manpreet suggested, those high quality critical minerals. Australia has the world's largest concentration of minerals that are critical to electric vehicle missions, as well as battery storage missions like lithium, cobalt, nickel, magnesium and vanadium. Australian mining and METS companies are gearing up to meet the burgeoning global demand as we transition towards that low carbon greener economy. As Manpreet has said, Prime Minister Modi's government's working to increase the share of renewable energy in India's mix and to boost the local manufacture and adoption of electric vehicles and battery storage. And we can play a big role in assisting India to achieve their economic ambitions whilst also benefiting the people across Australia. In conclusion, can I simply say these are challenging times, but they've taught us perseverance. They've highlighted the benefits of collaboration, whether on vaccines or in other areas, and of course, realised immense opportunities. With the CEP, with the National Education Policy of India and with the Australian India Education Council, I believe the framework, the policy framework is now in place for the true internationalisation of education between our nations. This country and Australia have closed their borders to improve the health of their citizens. Whilst it's caused frustrations in both nations, at the end of the day, I think citizens, whether they're students or whether they're students' families, will value a country that puts the health of those people in that country first. Thank you very much.
High Commissioner O'Farrell, thank you so much. And thank you to both High Commissioners for very powerful and, may I say, very complimentary statements. We now move to our panel discussion, and I'd like to give the floor to our first panellist, Ms. Suhasini Haidar. You're on mute, Suhasini.
Am I unmuted now? Thanks a lot, Michael. And one of the great things about living in two democracies and looking at a relationship between two democracies is really sometimes the kind of honesty and plain speaking that we hear, and we've heard it from the High Commissioners as well today. We understand that this is a relationship the two countries are committed to, and yet it is a relationship where the reality is short of ambition. And I think that's what we saw, sort of spelt out. So, what I find interesting really is that the relationship, if you were to look at four salient parts of it, the strategic level relationship, and that means at every level, the relationship outside of India, Australia, which is at the Quad. There is the hopes for trade and investment, and High Commissioner Ambassador Peter Varghese, who will be speaking, will really be the expert on that. And then there is the people-to-people ties, and it's very interesting for us how we have seen this kind of diasporic relationship become what the UK calls a living bridge. The US has acknowledged importantly, and we see Australia acknowledge as much as well. So I think what is really interesting to me is where we can perhaps see areas for improvement. Of course, the leaders have committed, and Prime Minister Morrison could not have committed more firmly to the Indian relationship than by inventing the scomosa. I've been thinking of recipes that Prime Minister Modi could sort of offer in return. Perhaps they involve Vegemite, but I'm not quite sure. But to the more, and the fact is they meet regularly. The 2+2 is now being institutionalized. There's a lot of back and forth at the leadership level. However, when it comes to some of the other places and the relationship that has been spoken about, I sometimes wonder if we wouldn't be more honest, if we would actually put the problems on the table rather than what we see as the goal, because we all know what the goal is. The goal is in India, Australia, tighter relationship, a more resilient, a reliable relationship, particularly when it comes to trade and investment. And yet, we see those goals being set out. Prime Minister Abbott, I think, has suggested once again a deadline, which I think is, he says that by the year end, we see an early harvest. Within a few weeks, we may restart talks between India and Australia. But we can't just wish away the history of these talks. By 2015, there had been 9 rounds of talks, and then those were shelved. Today, we're not quite sure if talks will begin as they were left off, or you begin with ground zero. If it's ground zero, an early harvest agreement will need a lot of push from both sides. We also have the subject of the RCEP that will come into play by 2022, January 1st, and has in it, and India was part of the negotiation, so India understands that, has in it clauses that will ensure that it is the 15 nations that are inside the RCEP that will find more benefit from trade with each other than they will from another country. So while I take the point that Australia is diversifying its trade, India is looking for a trade partner, the reality sort of belies some of those ambitions. And I think High Commissioner Farrell said this in an interview some weeks ago when he spoke about the need within the Indian industry as well to really put its back behind a trade deal, because otherwise we see other trade deals also flagging. And of course, you know, India's record over here, whether it's been with the European Union talks, whether it's been with the US, whether it has been with the UK or Australia, has not yet provided that breakthrough that would reinforce the hope. When it comes to the Quad, and I think vaccines are an important point, they were spoken a little bit about, but at this point, neither is Australia really sharing its excess vaccines, nor is India actually exporting. So neither are really playing to their capacities at this point. And it is hoped that that's something that will be part of the part of the conversation going forward. And finally, I think it is important that both High Commissioners have acknowledged the importance of the student population, because they are this very, very vital link between the two countries. High Commissioner Vohra has very plainly told The Guardian that there is a sense that Australia could risk its image among students because other countries where students do go have opened their universities up for Indian students. While High Commissioner Farrell has made the point quite rightly that that there is, every country is going to protect its own citizens first, but there are frustrations on both sides, and I do hope that this is addressed at the earliest. Finally, I think there are a lot of issues where Australia and India coming together can actually strengthen India's outlook and Australia's outlook with the rest of the world, and those are issues like data localization or data-free trade, issues like on climate change, how much each one is willing to commit to by 2050, and a number of other issues where I think there is a greater multilateral discussion than there is one at the bilateral level. I think it's important in that respect that Australian Prime Minister actually committed to the India-South Africa proposal at the WTO to make vaccines and other anti-COVID materials, take away the patent regime from them. But I think there's much more that can be done where India and Australia stand together at multilateral fora as well. So all in all, I think a lot to speak about in this Australia-India week, and thank you so much for having me on this.
Thank you so much, Suhasini. A lot there in your remarks as well. Can I turn to our next panelist, Peter Varghese? Over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this India Week panel discussion and to do so with some very old dear friends. I'm delighted that I can join you. So I was asked firstly to respond to the two very good presentations by our High Commissioners. And the first thing I'd say is that in my experience, High Commissioners are professional optimists, and that's a very good thing. It's a very good thing for two reasons. One is pessimism in diplomacy tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But secondly, the optimism in this case, I think, is quite well grounded because, as others have observed, I think we are in a sweet spot in the bilateral relationship Certainly, we're in a sweet spot in terms of the geopolitical congruence. I think there's lots of evidence that we're both looking to explore how much further we can take the economic relationship. And we have this extraordinary asset in our diaspora population in Australia, which I think is playing an important role in bringing the two communities together. But being in a sweet spot can sometimes lead you to a false sense of security. And I think the sobering reality about our respective futures is that it will be determined less by what we do together, Australia and India, and more by what we do at home. And let me just elaborate a bit on that point. So all nations at the moment, I think, face a bonfire of certainties as both our economic and geopolitical worlds go through pretty obviously profound changes. And how we respond to that mega challenge will, I think, ultimately determine our success. And for the most part, not exclusively, and I'll come back to that, those responses will be shaped by the policy choices we make at home. So for both India and Australia, I think there are two big questions. The first is, how do we each chart a course that puts us back onto economic growth in a world where an open economy is being challenged, where globalization is slowing, where protectionism is rising, and where international institutions, including international trade institutions, are weakening. And the second big question is, how do we create a new strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific, which can both engage and constrain China in its ambition to recreate the world of the Middle Kingdom? Now, India is ambitious for itself and Australia is ambitious for India, and I think that's a good thing. But that ambition can only be built off the back of a strong economy. So I think the question for India is, can it make the structural reforms that will return its economy to a path of 6 to 8% plus economic growth? And the question for Australia is, can we find an economic reform agenda which addresses our declining productivity and positions the country for the challenges of the future? And I'll make this point, that both Australia and India have done best economically when they have been most open to the world and to the global marketplace. Now, the economic responses, I think, are largely going to be questions of national economic choice, and they'll test our respective systems and our respective political leadership. The geopolitical challenges, on the other hand, are not challenges that can be resolved through even the most brilliant national policy choices. They are questions which can only ultimately be resolved by a very large element of collaboration and cooperation. And that is why I think the geopolitical component of our relationship into the future is going to get much stronger. So to move from the sort of global context to the bilateral context, it's now 3 years since the India economic strategy was submitted to the Australian Prime Minister. And for my part, I still think the core judgments in that strategy remain valid, but there is no question that COVID has probably pushed out the timelines in that strategy by 2 to 3 years. What we're also seeing, partly as a consequence of COVID, partly as a consequence of other drivers internationally, is that the intersection between geopolitics and economics is becoming sharper because what we have now, which we didn't have when we were writing the India economic strategy, is a sense that there are areas of economic cooperation that we should enter into, which are largely driven by geopolitical impulses. And I'm thinking here particularly of supply chain security and critical minerals. So we've got additions to our economic agenda which are driven by geopolitics. But ultimately, I think the judgment that there is a well-anchored structural complementarity between our two economies, and that structural complementarity will drive our economic relationship remains broadly accurate. And I think the sectors and states approach is also sensible in the post-COVID world as it was in the pre-COVID world. On Seeker, and we've just had Tony Abbott's visit to India, I certainly think we should try and see what's possible and how far we can go. But personally, I would caution an overinvestment in the idea of a seeker. It would, without question, be a very good thing to do, and it would be a very good thing to do as rapidly as possible. But there are also a lot of very good things that we can do on the economic front, on the trade front, on the investment front, on the market access front, which don't depend on the negotiation of a seeker. I think there's still a lot of hard yards before we get a comprehensive agreement across the line. At the moment, I think levels of ambition are probably a bit too far apart. I'm personally a skeptic about an early harvest approach. I think an early harvest reduces the incentive for a comprehensive agreement and runs a very high risk of ending up with a lowest common denominator outcome. But let's see how far and how substantively we can go. So, I mean, if I were to sort of summarize my own thinking at this point in our bilateral relationship, I'd say that I'm still very much in the camp of a long-term optimist about this relationship. I think there are some deep structural drivers which will keep pushing us closer together. I think what's happening in India is a long-haul story. You're seeing an economy which is shifting on the back of deep structural drivers. The urbanization of the most agrarian society in the world, the investment now, significant investment in infrastructure, a demography which, if properly handled, can be an enormous asset for India, the shift from an informal economy to a formal economy. I mean, these are subterranean trends, which means that it's not going to be a flash in the pan, but nor can we just simply rely on structural drivers to deliver what we both as countries want to see for each other and for the bilateral relationship, because that will take national effort in addition to just trends playing themselves out. I think our willingness to work together on geopolitics, our forward-looking thinking on an economic agenda wherever we land on Seeker, and that diaspora connection, to my mind, remain the bedrock for that long-term optimism.
Peter, thank you so much. I think the phrase bonfire of the certainties will stick with us all for a while. Can we now move to our third And final panelist, Professor Priyam Manisha. Professor Manisha, the floor is yours. You're on mute, Professor.
Thank you, Michael. And I greet everybody on the 75th anniversary of our independence. And in more ways than one, our people-to-people relationships predates India's formal independence. And I will, in a few moments, take you down to a few vignettes of history that tie our own histories of independent India in education with the concrete support that we've had from the University of Melbourne in Australia. But before I come down to those vignettes of history, let me underscore very much the points that were made in His Excellency Barry O'Farrell's comments about the new education policy and our own High Commissioner Manpreet Vohra, and of course our Prime Minister last week addressing the nation on the completion of 1 year of India's new National Education Policy 2020. Let me state at the very beginning that the efforts on the Australian part to connect on the front of education, to connect with a new India that's transformed in many ways with high levels of urbanization, but very high levels of vulnerability, to connect people to people in the education sector, in the university sector, actually predates the Indian efforts and predates the geopolitical collaborations that we can see in the rise of the Quad. By about 2014-15, the Australian government was working very hard, the University of Melbourne at the very forefront of all this, sending their senior most people as well as the most prolific academics, building people-to-people and research collaboration agendas with Indian governments on issues that are of deep interest to us, and some of the most outstanding developments that have been made as a result of collaborations now that I can very happily say date about 7 years of strong relationships when Provost Peter McPhee visited an international conference hosted by the NUPA in 2014-15. The University of Melbourne are about to, if I may say, set up a Center for Youth Excellence, of which India is an able partner. And this will take Indian thinking to the Indo-Pacific region. In India here, it allows us to see the world of education, to see the world of educational collaboration in non-North American and non-European formats. This would be the first of its kind that we will make a transition to looking at the Indo-Pacific, which we all understand is an emerging area of geopolitical strategic concerns, also of the economy. But I think these moves on the educational front had been made even before much of the changes that we see, the contemporary world face. Now, I'm going to just put two parameters of change that these relationships need to account for now. One is climate change, that in my visit to Australia in 2019, I could see even school students had the agenda of climate change in Australia. And that's the level of people-to-people collaboration that we need from the Australian thinking now, how to put climate change as a people's issue in India. At this moment, climate change is an issue of people's vulnerability and suffering, but not that of people's agency. And the second, obviously, is COVID vulnerabilities that we experience here. Let me iterate the points that His Excellency Barry O'Farrell made. Closing the national barriers has meant that we've suffered our own vulnerabilities in our diversities. Now, as we open up, it's going to be extremely important to look at learning and new education policy in a new format. If we are aware, the Oxford Stringency Index has said that India's school lockdowns have been amongst one of the most stringent in the world, creating an education emergency like none other. And therefore, we are likely to face learning deficits that we had hoped by some chance that we would have been bridging those. Now, those gaps will be even more deeper and we would be rendered even more vulnerable. People-to-people connections, university-level connections, allow us to speak the two democracies in their diversities and to respect and respond to the inequalities and vulnerabilities that India, Gandhi almost wore these vulnerabilities on his body. And I think we acknowledge that as much as we may like to be an economic power, we have to acknowledge that there is an India within that has to travel along. And therefore, it's the public systems that are very important. I now come to the propositions in the new education policy, where I feel the collaboration that has already been ongoing between the Australian side and the Indian can strengthen very much. The Center for Youth Excellence is really going to be a transformational institution. It's going to look at youth power, not just in its vulnerabilities, but actioning out youth power for change, echoing very much the message that Prime Minister Modi sent out as he spoke on the eve of completion of 1 year of the new national education policy. Now, the 2 points where we require the Australian support and where I'm going to bring in the historical vignette is the intent of the new education policy to build large multidisciplinary universities. Remember, India does not have a world-class university, and we aspire to have one. It's an important component to have if we are to compete very well in the knowledge economy. We know we are there. We are the Argonauts for the Silicon Valley. But how do we transform our university capacity and put that imprint on the world? I think that's something we're building, large multidisciplinary universities from what we have, not from greenfield universities, but from the existing public university format. I think those would be policy collaborations. And let me take you back to the vignette of history. In 1916, when India was struggling to set up its own universities, different from the colonial universities that colonial power at its height set up in the presidency townships of Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai, known as Madras then. At that point of time, it was the Australians and the University of Melbourne that came to the specific support in setting up India's premier university, premier public university, the University of Mysore. A full-scale commission traveled in 1916, led by Thomas Denham and C. Ramling Reddy, who traveled to the University of Melbourne, and much of the governance structures for the University of Mysore, and thereafter copied in many other public universities in India. The democratic formats of the Senate and the syndicate, leading university governance structures then, were borrowed very much and thought about and reflected upon in conversation with the university delegation of the University of Melbourne. Let me also add another vignette of history that C. Ramling Reddy had spent his student life at the University of Cambridge in the August company of John Kenneth Galbraith, where he facilitated a meeting between Gopal Krishna Gokhale and John Kenneth Galbraith. And the feeling was that youth capacity and full employment need to be the goals to which we need to tether our universities. Now, those very much remain the goals, the not very neat and tidy pathways to the labor market in the Indian university system. We need to untangle some of that. Bringing skills and universities together is just one pathway. What more must we do? So that's one of the propositions that the Australian experience in this matter is historically founded. The relationships have history to them, and let us build forward on those relationships. Now, the second part is that there be emphasis on research collaborations, which are really egalitarian. They look at our education professionals, our university professors as equal partners. It is not enough to say that X and Y and Z are of poor qualities. India today has a landscape of nearly 1,000 universities and 43,000 colleges. And any transformation must take into account the fact that these will have to be brought on par with quality and excellence that the world recognizes, and the support that is already quite deep between the Australian side and ours, that must be deepened further. And I will conclude by saying that apart from this also, at my meetings with the Victorian government, I'd emphasize the points that teacher training is an area where there is a need for quality. Once upon a time in the state of Andhra Pradesh, the UK government took that initiative, training its teachers in a land mode, in an offline mode, by taking them to the UK. Let the Australian side also think about innovative ways in which teacher training capacities can be built. And I would like to say that at the very end, we also have a large segment of what are called scheduled tribe or Janjati population, just like the Aboriginal population in India. And our educational figures say that the educational disadvantage happens to be the most for them. as India is moving towards what is known as massification, the stage of near universal participation of all groups, classes of students into higher education, the scheduled tribes really lag behind for more reasons than one. On these fronts, we seek to learn from how the differences of population in your country were handled as you move on the road towards transforming elite higher education to mass and universal systems. Constructing universal systems of higher education is actually reconstituting democracy within the arena of education. We look together to a strong and robust partnership which recognizes our democracies and which recognizes our differences. And I believe very much that economic reforms and educational reforms need not be seen as wedded together. Educational reforms, as the history and trajectory since 1991 tell us, can precede our economic performance. We can come there, get there. Educational reforms need not wait any longer. Thank you very much. And I once again greet everybody on the occasion of our hard-fought and won independence, the 75th independence of India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Manisha. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Now, looking at the time, I'm going to hand across to Professor Muthupandiyan Ashok, who is the acting CEO and director of the Australia-India Institute, for some closing remarks. Professor Ashok. Ashok, you're still on mute.
Thank you, Michael. On behalf of the Australia-India Institute, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to both the High Commissioners. Their ongoing support to the Institute is greatly appreciated. I would like to thank the panel members for their participation despite their busy schedule. Thank you, Chancellor, for your welcome remarks. Thank you, Michael, for moderating the discussion. Today's interactive discussion on Australia-India partnership in the economy and education sector has been very informative and is useful for most of us for enhancing our Australia-India engagement activities. The clear message that we have received today from the High Commissioners is that there are more opportunities for stronger engagement between our countries. I also thank our Institute staff, in particular Simone, who has been working on the India Week program for many weeks. Also to Mariana for overlooking the program development and Brina for taking care of the promotional activities. Finally, I'd like to thank all the participants for their attendance and support. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Ashok. And let me bring this session to a close. It's been a wonderfully rich session. I'd urge you all to have a look at the comments and the questions in the comments section. And I wish the AII all the best for the rest of its India Week. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.